As I mentioned, this is the webinar for the Open Opportunity Enhancing the Flavor of Plant-Based and Fermentation-Derived Proteins. We're excited to have you all. This opportunity is a partnership between the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and the Good Food Institute. So I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. I'm Nicholas Goldsmith. I'm the Research Funding Partnerships Manager at the Good Food Institute. And as I mentioned, this Open Opportunity is a partnership between the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and the Good Food Institute. We're really excited to share this opportunity with you and to get your questions. Again, please put the questions in the Q&A section on the Zoom meeting. There will be a recording of this webinar, which will be posted on the FAR opportunity page. The link to the RFA should also have been put into the chat. So during this webinar, we'll start out with some introductions to the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and the Good Food Institute. We'll then move on to an overview of the Open Opportunity. After that, we'll discuss the application components. This will be followed by the evaluation criteria. Then we'll discuss some ecosystem building resources that we have. And finally, we'll open it up for questions and answers. And throughout the presentation of this webinar, you'll hear from staff at both the Good Food Institute and the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. Next slide. So I'll start out by introducing my organization, the Good Food Institute. So the Good Food Institute is a nonprofit, science-driven think tank and international network of organizations that advances alternative proteins to help meet climate, global health, food security, and biodiversity goals. So we are powered by philanthropy, and we act as a force multiplier, bringing our expertise of our staff throughout our various departments to the rest of the world. And we have staff in 7 regions, including the Asia-Pacific region, Brazil, Europe, India, Israel, Japan, and the United States. Next slide. So what is it we actually do at the Good Food Institute? Well, we're a nonprofit that works across science and technology, corporate engagement, and policy to support a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. The GFIers that are on this call are all a part of the science and technology team. And so what our department does is we work on analyzing, mobilizing funding, and building communities and talent. So the first part of that is analyzing. We analyze knowledge gaps and white spaces, looking for challenges and opportunities in building that sustainable, just, and secure protein supply. And these analyses then drive everything else that we do. On the slide, you'll see photos of 2 of our recent analyses. One is a side stream analysis for common commodity crops, and another is a techno-economic assessment for fermentation-derived ingredients. And it's these kinds of analyses that motivate the rest of the work that we do and really highlight where we spend our effort. We at the Good Food Institute also work on mobilizing funding. That's the work like you're seeing here, as well as our own internal grant program and other efforts to inform research funders. The science and technology team also works to build community and cultivate talent through things like workforce development, curriculum development, and enabling connections among researchers in the protein space. So that's a little bit about the Good Food Institute, and I will hand it over to the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research.
All right, thanks, Nicholas. Hello, everybody. We are really glad to have you join us today. My name is Rebecca Jewu, a Senior Scientific Program Officer with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, also known as FAR. Today, I'm joined by three of my colleagues. You'll be hearing from them shortly. We have Dr. Piera Penescu, our AAAS Fellow, who will walk us through the application component. We have Marina Middleton, our Grants Officer, and she will be in the background to answer any grants related questions during the Q&A session. And then Sam Bader, our communications officer, and she will facilitate the Q&A session. So I will begin with a brief introduction to FAR, and then I'll invite Nikki from GFI to provide the program overview. So FAR came into existence in 2014 through the Farm Bill with a mandate to connect funders, researchers, and farmers to pioneer the next frontier of agriculture innovation. Our mission, next slide, please. Our mission is to build collaborative partnerships to support audacious science addressing today's food and agriculture challenges. And we do so through four main mechanisms. Next slide. So these funding mechanisms include the competitive grants, which is this current call, direct awards, prizes, and consortia. Next slide. So we fund our research by focusing on four priority areas, and these areas are cultivating thriving production systems, bolstering healthy food systems. So this current RFA call falls under this priority area, sustainable, vibrant agro ecosystems, and strengthening the scientific workforce. So this ends my brief introduction to FAR. Now I will invite Nikki to provide a program overview of this RFA.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. My name is Nikki. I'm a scientist at GFI focused on the plant-based space. I'd also like to introduce you to my colleague, Adam Lehman, who's a scientist at GFI focused on fermentation. You won't be hearing from him during the presentation slides, but he's here in the background to help answer questions. Okay, so with GFI and FAR, our partnership really centers around a shared vision for a healthy food system that makes high quality, nutritious, affordable food equitably accessible while minimizing impacts on the environment and supporting the economy. So we focused our call together on proteins because global demand for protein continues to rise. And we believe that advancing ingredient innovation for protein production will be essential to meet the growing global demand for meat, which shows no signs of slowing down, according to this great figure from Our World in Data. So improving plant-based proteins and fermentation-derived proteins in a scalable, market-based way will diversify protein sources for a safe and resilient food system that drives economic growth throughout the value chain. However, this area of research requires much more investment. A recent global innovation needs assessment found that global public investment needed is $4.4 billion per year in funding for sustainable protein research. Although public support has increased, there have been very few targeted funding opportunities to address the critical bottlenecks that prevent plant-based and fermentation-derived adoption and production. So we know that taste and price and scalability are critical to production and adoption, but to better understand the research needs that will enable those goals, we developed a partnership to address challenges related to ingredient optimization that took several steps to understand the technical landscape. We essentially worked through two phases, the first of which was centered around a global submission of ideas, in which we solicited input from experts around the world, many of which I see on the call today. So it's nice to see some friendly names in the participant list. We asked you all, what are the biggest challenges and most tractable solutions in this area? We synthesized those and then held an in-person workshop last summer where we brought together several key stakeholders to help us refine our understanding of the research needs and landscape, which resulted in this comprehensive report shown here and also linked with the RFA. From that report, we identified the scope of this RFA, which is focused on enhancing the flavor of plant-based and fermentation-derived proteins. So the idea is that even though plants and microorganisms can produce all the building blocks that we need, getting to flavors that consumers actually love is still one of the biggest hurdles. This is further exacerbated by off flavors, both the ones that naturally show up in plant and microbial proteins, and also the ones that pop up because of variability in source materials or how they're processed into ingredients and products. The good news is that there are some real opportunities to tackle this across the entire value chain using a range of different approaches, and that's exactly what this RFA is aiming to do. Support upstream breakthroughs in ingredient optimization for flavor so that we can eventually improve customer adoption and ultimately drive market growth. So the research areas supported include, but are not limited to the following: reducing and identifying off flavors in plant-based and fermentation-derived protein ingredients through physical, biological, or computational approaches across all stages of production. Leveraging hybrid ingredients for complementary functions that balance flavor across blended formulations. Designing desirable flavors by understanding and optimizing flavor precursors, extraction and reaction processes, and compound formulation. And last example here is reducing batch-to-batch variability in flavor attributes of protein ingredients, for example, through advances in processing control, compositional analysis, or predictive modeling. Overall, applicants should clearly identify the flavor-related challenges that they aim to address, the methods proposed, and a plan to ensure that the results are robust, transparent, reproducible, and broadly impactful. So eligibility for this call is limited to nonprofit institutions of higher education. Students are not eligible to serve as the principal investigators. And we do encourage applications from all eligible domestic and international higher education institutions. Research does not have to be conducted in the US. The institutions may be located outside, though we do ask that on the next slide, research proposed is somehow relevant to the US food and agriculture landscape. And invite you to think broadly here, as the US is geographically, economically, and culturally diverse. However, research that is not relevant to the US food and agriculture space is out of scope. So this means that things like ingredients or components banned in the US or very niche crops that are highly regional are out of scope, for example. So to that end, we encourage applicants to include a statement on how their research is relevant to US food and ag. Other research not supported is proposals focus on ingredients for other food applications beyond meat, seafood, dairy, and egg alternatives. So that's things like pastas, bakery, protein flours, protein supplements. And we are also not supporting research focused on traditional plant-based protein foods like tofu or tempeh, and things like protein bars, condiments, desserts, or feed for non-human purposes. So more on this in the RFA, but we've also decided to exclude texturization-focused research solely, and plant-based or fermentation-derived milk research. An important footnote here, though, is that yogurt, egg, and cheese alternatives may be considered within scope, but proposals that explore those primarily as standalone products are less likely to be competitive. So, for example, proposals that explore those as a support for center of plate products like egg alternatives for plant-based proteins are more likely to be competitive. We're also not supporting research that uses animal-derived ingredients or any upstream inputs from animals, or any research that may cause harm to animal or human subjects. And last, we are excluding human subject research with the exception of trained sensory panels, understanding that consumer-facing methods will ultimately be needed. But with this RFA, we're intentionally focusing upstream on early stage development and process development. So we limited the human subject exception to that for analytical evaluation. Next up, just some details on the award itself. So the projects we're asking to fund are up to 500,000 US with a duration of 2 to 3 years. We anticipate funding 4 to 6 projects overall, and we're allowing up to 10% in indirect costs, and equipment costs of no more than 25%. And finally, the matching funds are not required for this RFA. And with that, I will hand it off to Pri Panescu from FAR to take us through the application components.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see so many folks from around the globe joining in and saying hi in the chat. And we see a lot of really great questions coming in, so keep them up. My name is Pri Panescu Scott, and I'm at FAR as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in their Bolstering Healthy Food Systems group. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be going over the application components. I highly recommend carefully reading the RFA to ensure that you're getting all the application components and buttoned up exactly for what we're asking for, but I will go over it briefly right now as well. So there's obviously some really standard application components like information about the PI, project title, abstract, duration, geographic location. Where the application is maybe a little bit special compared to other applications is that there's really two larger components. So the first is a proposal screening information. And in that one, it's up to 600 words, but you really want to have it be very compelling. And I'll describe why later as I describe the review process. But this is a very punchy, relatable, description of the project. So you really want to discuss what gaps you're addressing, what solutions you're using to address those gaps, really briefly mention the approach and methods, and describe its relevance to the US, as well as maybe global context. So in this punchier version, it'll still have a lot of the information that'll be in the project narrative. So there might be parts where it feels a little bit repetitive, but the project narrative is up to 4,000 words. So it's a little bit longer. And there you'll have a little bit more time to talk about the relevant background information, justification, if there was any preliminary research, clearly state the hypothesis, give a project description and approach, as a potential risk to the research, and mitigation plans are incredibly important as well. And again, really, really emphasizing how the project is either clearly part of US context agriculture and food, or will be able to be transferable to the US context. Next slide, please. In addition to those more straightforward things and the longer descriptions, we also have these kind of straightforward things that you might expect on a grant application. So a data management plan, a description of pathways to adoption and commercialization, if applicable. Again, what are the potential barriers to adoption or regulatory obstacles, and how would those barriers or obstacles be addressed? Yes, outline of a brief description of project objectives, activities, anticipated outputs, an intellectual property management plan. So please refer to FAR's IP policy in order to develop that plan. And then budget summary, which there should be a form that is available to do that budget summary, and you'll see that on the application. And then budget overview and justification. So one thing to note here is that equipment is considered a durable good and costs that exceed $5,000. So GFI will limit equipment requests to 25% of the total budget. Again, these exact descriptions and qualifications are written really specifically within the application, so I highly recommend reading that carefully. Additionally, GFI will be hosting a meeting for PIs in the spring of 2027, so definitely encourage incorporating those funds into the budget plan there. And so what is required and what is optional? So required budget form, as I mentioned, there is a form. Please find that and fill it out. Current and pending support. So this is required for the PI as well as any key personnel. A Gantt chart that outlines the project timeline by quarterly intervals. There are plenty of Gantt chart templates available online. So if that's something that maybe you haven't had the chance of doing yet, hopefully it's a fun exercise that helps organize the project. And then references cited, these will not count towards the word limits of the project narrative. So please do include those references. And then bio sketches, again, there's more information about what those bio sketches are and should look like on the website, but it's a 5-page limit per individual. Here are the things that are optional. So this includes additional key personnel, any supporting figures, tables, graphics, or equations. And again, those won't count towards the word limit. So please feel free to add in those visuals. You can also give us this 3-slide summary or description of the project if that's something that you think will be able to convey the project a little bit easier. And then these two are kind of the bigger ones. So letters of collaboration. We are not looking for letters of support. We're looking for letters of collaboration. So if there are folks who are directly collaborating with you on this project, those letters of collaboration are really, really helpful for us to just kind of check the boxes and make sure that those collaborations are in the works. Additionally, if there is matching funds, please include the contribution letter. But again, this is optional. So matching funds for this RFA is optional. Next slide, please. So how to apply, this is relatively straightforward. You're going to be going through a grant management system that FAR uses, and it's called Blackbaud Grant Management, BBGM. And so if you haven't, if you're a new user, you're going to have to register and create an account. But if you've already made an account, then you can just start a new application. And applications submitted outside of the system will not be considered, so please do use BBGM. Yes, and once you log in, please make sure to save your work. I think we've all been there where you're kind of kicking yourself because you didn't save your work. So just make sure to save your application and you're able to access that saved application through the grant management account. So I promised I would talk about the review and selection process. And here is the reason why the proposal screening checklist is really important, that 600 words up front. So it will be submitted with the full proposals, but as we're reviewing, that proposal screening checklist is actually going to be the first part of the internal review for FAR and GFI to assess the project. So we'll be assessing if it's relevant to the RFA, if it's innovative and advances plant-based and fermentation-derived protein ingredients, and if it's impactful and translatable to U.S. food and agriculture. So again, you really want to make sure that you hit those points in that short summary. The top applications from those proposal screening checklists will then undergo a full proposal review, where all of the application will be reviewed, and that'll go under a 2-stage process where first reviewer feedback and alignment with program objectives and FAR and GFI's research priorities. And then a second part of the process, FAR and GFI will then review the positive funding recommendations and make final selection decisions. We really want to emphasize that peer reviewers must agree and adhere to FAR's conflict of interest policy and non-disclosure agreement. We work very, very hard to make sure that there's no conflicts of interest with our reviewers, and that it's a really great process. Next slide, please. And then finally, if you need any assistance, again, please read the RFA carefully because a lot of the questions are answered within there. But if you do have general applications questions, please see questions about the grant portal, budget template, all on FAR's applicant FAQs. And then on the actual RFA landing page, there's going to be RFA specific FAQs as well. We're kind of building that as we go, but there's already a few up there. So review to those FAQs, the general one for FARs applications, as well as this RFA specific one when you do have those questions. Excellent. And then with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Nicholas, who will be discussing evaluation criteria.
Yes. Hello. So there are three criteria that reviewers will consider when evaluating your proposal. The first criterion is the technical merit, novelty, and innovation criterion, which will account for 45% of the evaluation. The second criterion is the feasibility, relevance, anticipated outcomes, and impact criterion, which will also account for 45% of the evaluation. And then the final criterion is the qualifications criterion, which will account for 10% of those evaluations. I'll go through what each of these actually means, but I will also note that there are specific questions in the RFA under each of these evaluation criteria to help you understand what we're meaning by each of these. Next slide. So for the technical merit, novelty, and innovation criterion, which again is 45% of the evaluation, the reviewers are going to be considering the extent to which your proposal articulates a problem and its significance, the extent to which there is a clear research question and hypothesis. Reviewers will consider the novelty and innovative potential of the proposed research. Reviewers will also consider if the methods proposed are effective, efficient, and feasible. Reviewers will be looking for a clear and comprehensive data management plan. Reviewers will also be considering if the budget is justified by the work plan. And then finally, in this review criterion, reviewers will be considering whether or the extent to which your proposal builds on the previous established literature in the field, and the extent to which your proposed work will be able to further extend that literature and add to it. Next slide. For the feasibility, relevance, anticipated outcomes, and impact criterion, which is also 45% of the evaluation of your proposals, reviewers will be considering the feasibilities of your goals and work plan. They will also consider the scalability and commercial potential of the work outcome, and that includes how the work is disseminated. Reviewers are going to consider the extent to which you examine the pathways and barriers to adoption of your proposed work. Reviewers will be looking for clear objectives and a plan for tracking progress towards those objectives. This is also where reviewers will consider that benefit or transferability to the U.S. food and agriculture system that we discussed earlier. Reviewers will consider the potential your proposed work has to have an impact beyond the life of the proposed work itself. Reviewers will also consider the potential of your proposed work to improve consistency or variability that affects flavor. And then finally, under this review criterion, reviewers will consider whether or not the proposers plan to engage users and stakeholders in their work. Next slide. The final criterion that reviewers will consider when examining your proposal are the qualifications, and this will account for 10% of the evaluation. So for the qualifications section, reviewers will consider whether or not the research team has appropriate and adequate expertise to undertake the work they're proposing. They'll also consider whether or not the research team has access to the necessary facilities and equipment to conduct the research. Reviewers will also be looking for either existing partnerships or pathways to develop new partnerships to advance this work and lead towards implementation. Finally, reviewers are going to consider whether or not the proposal demonstrates a willingness to engage others in advancing the research. So as I said, more details on these specific review criteria can be found in the RFA, and I suggest that you look at these closely when you're writing your proposal. Next slide. So finally, before we get to the question and answer section, we'll talk about some ecosystem building resources that are available to you. Next slide. So we really want to encourage collaborations with this RFA. This includes international collaborations. It also includes collaborations with people and institutions that are outside of academia. So when you're considering writing the proposal and who you might collaborate with, there are a few resources you might find helpful. One is that the Good Food Institute has an alternative protein researcher directory. And in this researcher directory, you can find researchers in various fields across plant-based and fermentation-derived proteins that you may have an interest in collaborating with. If you feel that you should be in this directory and are not, there is also the ability to submit a form to be added to the directory. The Good Food Institute also has an alternative protein ecosystem map, and that's what this screenshot is on the side of the slide. And so this ecosystem map contains information on student groups, companies, researchers, courses, networks, and other research institutions. And so encourage you, if you're considering collaborators, to look at the ecosystem map. You can potentially hone in on regions that you're interested in collaborating with. And again, like the others, that plus sign is a way to request additions to the ecosystem map. In addition to these existing GFI resources, FAR and GFI are also trying to help encourage collaborations through the collaborative information that we had in the webinar registration. So for those of you who opted to share collaborative information when you did the webinar registration, that information will be made available by email. So we'd encourage you, those of you who signed up to share that information, to look through and see if there are any potential partnerships that can be built through that. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sam Bader of FAR to facilitate the Q&A session.
Hi, everyone. We have a good deal of questions. Some of them have already been answered. I'd encourage you to check those that have already been answered, just in case we don't have time to verbally get to each of them. So first question, I would like clarification regarding the RFA's restriction of sensory evaluation except for trained panel. How could enhancing flavor be ultimately measured if not with human participants? Trained panels are only one way to do this.
I'm happy to take that one. Okay, turning my camera back on. Yeah, so thanks for that question. We are aware and we recognize that there are lots of other methods to use, and we agree that they play a critical role. We also know that consumer-facing methods will be ultimately needed, but here we really intended to focus upstream in the development process and limited to trained panels just to support analytical evaluation of new ingredients, processes, or products before they're ready for broader consumer testing. And that's comes from a few different reasons, but one is that it's a practical consideration for this funding opportunity, which is scope and budget. So those larger consumer studies can be resource intensive, and we wanted to avoid situations where a big portion of a project's budget is allocated to a single consumer test, potentially at the expense of other earlier stage work. And we know that trained sensory panels exclude some methods by definition, but we felt that was sort of the cleanest way to include sensory evaluation without having it dominate a research study design. And yeah, we're hoping that some of this research matures towards other methods, including consumer and hedonic studies, and that's something we'll definitely consider in the future. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. Next question is, to what extent are preliminary results considered in the evaluation of a grant proposal?
Sure, I can take that one. So, you know, preliminary work is great to demonstrate feasibility of the potential work. That said, we don't want to fund research that has already occurred. So preliminary data can be very helpful in demonstrating the feasibility of your methods. But again, ultimately, work will need to be done during the proposal period.
Great, thank you. Next question. The RFA states consumer relevance. What minimum elements do you expect in a strong proposal? And given the restriction on human subject research, what kinds of evidence count as consumer relevant here? Does this rule eliminate all consumer preference work, or could a consumer preference / WTP be included in some limited form, for example, using secondary data or a small add-on component?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but um, I think there's lots of literature on what is consumer relevant in this area and what sorts of things need to be worked on. So kind of pointing towards that to create a strong proposal would be my first recommendation. And then this doesn't rule out all consumer or not sure what the second part of the question is, but we are allowing sensory panels as a way to um, evaluate the work done here.
Okay, thank you. Next question. At the end of an award, what outcome would you consider a measurable success for this program? Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can. Sorry about that. I think we're kind of thinking about this because I think measurable outcomes can look like a lot of different things. I would say kind of looking at the development stages of what technology you're looking at. If the technology is able to move up in stage development, so something that is closer to commercialization, adaptability, something that's adaptable for the industry, that would be really, really great and successful to us. And that's, of course, going to look like a lot of different things depending on what stage you're starting at and what stage you end up at. But it could look like a number of different things. And yeah, it's a little bit hard to define exactly what those measurable outcomes are, but of course, conferences, publications are really, really helpful to look at. And when we're evaluating how well a grant program or individual grants are doing, we use a number of measurable outcomes to look at that and don't define it in just one singular way. So sorry, that's a little bit of a nebulous answer, but hopefully it's helpful.
Great, thank you. The next question. Not all sensory researchers have access to trained panels, and the cost of a training panel will exceed the cost of consumer testing. So not quite a question, but maybe someone can address the trained panel component.
Yeah, we understand that, and we know that there's lots of other methods that can be used. However, this is how it's included now, and we'll definitely take that into consideration for future funding opportunities.
Thank you. We have a question. Are you looking for fundamental research on flavors, processing impact, or ready to scale technology application for that purpose?
So I can take a stab at that. Like I described before, what it looks like exactly is going to be dependent on the project. And different stages of development are going to scale differently based off of this grant award. But I think we're looking very much at these fundamental but very, very feasible academic research or research that's able to then be translated into the industry. So fundamental is great. Something that's ready to scale up is great. But being able to look at the evaluation criteria is a really great place to kind of quantify this, balancing a novel approach that hasn't really been explored fully yet with something that is going to be feasible for commercial scale. So I think the answer to your question is like either of those could really work. If something's really, really close to being commercialized, I would say describe as much as you can how it is novel and how it's moving forward the field in a different way than it's already going. And if something's more fundamental, I would really recommend, giving a case for how it's going to be relevant to the industry, how it would scale up. If you kind of see a vision for that path, put it in your application. We would love to see that. So, hopefully that's helpful.
Great, thank you. Is the focus of the RFA limited to off-flavor reduction, or does it include active taste enhancement and flavor profile improvement?
Yeah, definitely the latter. It's not limited to off-flavor reduction. We're looking at enhancing flavor through any method throughout the value chain, whether that's making flavor enhancers, reducing off flavors, improving processing, open to any and all of those approaches.
Next question. On the eligibility side, can you go over Research Institute and who is eligible? Would a for-profit business that is strongly based on research be eligible?
Hello. So the call is restricted. So to serve as a project grantee, the applicant must be a nonprofit institution of higher education. There's a little more verbiage in the RFA about nonprofit that you might want to look at if you're questioning if you fall under that. A for-profit company, though, is not a nonprofit. That said, we are encouraging collaboration. And so while a for-profit company would not be eligible to serve as the project grantee, they could collaborate with an eligible institution. The eligible institution would then need to be the institution to submit the proposal and to serve as the project grantee, but they could collaborate with institutions that are not otherwise eligible.
Thank you. We have a question. I'm in the UK for a novel food ingredient. Are we expected to have consulted the FDA from the US and the FSA from the UK as pre-application, or is a literature-based risk assessment acceptable?
I can take a stab at this one. So we're looking at basic research here. So while a pathway to commercialization and something that would pass muster for regulatory is a good way to look for that broadly impactful path for the future, any sort of communication with the regulatory body is not required.
Okay. Can traditional livestock-based protein/food products be utilized as a control for sensory, nutritional, and chemical comparisons?
Nicholas, you might be the person to answer this.
Sure. So for this research, animal-derived products or ingredients should not be utilized.
Thank you. Next question. Can an international RTO, a research center, partner up with a higher education institute and apply for the call? And if so, is there a budget specific for these partners? We have a few questions similar to this about private partnering and how to get around there. So maybe just provide a bit more detail on exactly what that means.
Yes. So in order to be the project grantee, an institution must be a nonprofit institution of higher education. And I encourage you to look at the specific wording around nonprofit in the RFA. That said, those institutions can partner with institutions that are not eligible, like research centers, like companies, as well as, of course, partnering with other nonprofit institutions of higher education. There's not a set budget for that partnership. that will be up to you when you draft your budget and justifying it in the budget justification. But those should be structured as subawards depending on the nature of those collaborations.
Thank you. We have a few questions around GCO and GCMS, whether they're acceptable and encouraged.
Yeah, I think the analytical methods that seem correct for the research that you're doing, I could definitely see those, those equipment being really helpful for measuring, volatile compounds, things like that.
Is there a requirement for how much protein should be in the final product?
No, that wasn't stated in the RFA. So, but we are looking for sort of center of plate protein foods. So just broadly kind of keep that in mind.
Is microalgae considered as a plant?
We consider microalgae a fermentation-derived ingredient, therefore it would be in scope, but single-cell microalgae are considered a fermentation platform by GFI.
Since the matching funds are optional and not clearly reflected in the evaluation criteria, can you clarify whether including an industry partner matching funds offers any sort of competitive advantage? I'll also tag on, there's some similar questions about competitive advantage for things in the requirement. Like there's a question of does having a US partner give a competitive advantage? So if we can talk about the requirements and the optionals and where that competitive advantage is.
I think the competitive advantage is laid out throughout the evaluation criteria, as well as the research supported and research not supported. So those are how the proposal will be evaluated. So having a US partner does not, in and of itself, is not one of those evaluation criteria, right? So it's not going to give you a competitive advantage. We do encourage everyone, whether US-based or not, to explain how your proposal will benefit or will be transferable to the US food and agriculture system. But just having a US partner alone is not part of that review criteria. Same thing for bringing matching funds. That's not part of the review criterion, right? But there may be things that those matching funds enable you to do, right? They demonstrate a partnership. So there are ways in which you might be able to demonstrate how you meet those evaluation criteria with items, but your proposal is judged by the evaluation criteria and not some of these other factors.
Are bacteria-derived proteins through fermentation okay?
Yes, they are a fermentation-derived product. So again, the focus should be on the protein aspects of it and not necessarily on any other nutrients or bioavailable compounds that you might be thinking of from bacteria. In the case of like a plant-based substrate that's converted or fermented, but that the plant-based substrate is still the main ingredient, that's going to be considered the focus. It's really on the origin of the protein. So bacterial sources of protein are acceptable.
Thank you. If two institutions are participating in the project, is it permissible to have both of them, for both to designate a PI and share leadership as co-PIs?
Yeah, so that should be totally fine to have the co-PIs.
If working with an international partner, would it be of interest for some of the field trials to be conducted within the US as part of the translation to the US context within the term of that project?
So I think I'll just reiterate that just being performed in the US doesn't necessarily make the research beneficial to the US. It may demonstrate a way in which it can benefit or be transferable to the US. But just having the work conducted here alone does not demonstrate benefit or transferability to the US system.
Hi, I'm sorry to interrupt. There was an earlier question that was answered about co-PIs versus PIs. Only one researcher may serve as the PI of the project. You may have as many co-PIs as you would like, but the PI will be the point of contact that the administration of the project goes through. Thanks.
Thank you for that clarification, Marina. Is hybrid meat combining cultivated cells and plant-based proteins considered to be in scope?
So for this call, animal-derived products are not in scope, and so cultivated meat and cultivated animal components would not be in scope. We really want to focus on those plant-based and fermentation-derived proteins.
Should the research focus on just the ingredients, or should it also include the application step, since the application step would also have some of the off-flavor problems during the process?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And again, it's going to be really dependent on what you're proposing, but I think anywhere where you can demonstrate that the technology that you're developing will improve the off flavor of an end product, a center of the plate end product, is really, really strong. So if you are working on an ingredient, for instance, and you do want to show what it would look like in a prototype as far as improving the flavors, that could be really helpful. That being said, depending on how fundamental the technology is, maybe it's enough to just explore that within the ingredient. But anything that you can do to kind of bolster that end goal of enhancing the flavor of a center of the plate, plant-based, fermentation-derived protein product, that is very helpful.
Does developing genomic-based microbial consortia for enhancing flavors of fermented plant proteins, is this in scope for this RFA?
Yes, microbial consortia are allowed just as our single strain or single microbe approaches.
Would a proposal focusing on developing novel technologies for quality process control for flavor be acceptable?
That sounds in scope to me, yeah, if it's so just something geared towards enhancing flavor, and you can make that line very strongly for us, then sounds like it, yeah.
The RFA mentions research focus on upstream microbial and crop development as an area that is not supported. Can you please clarify this a bit more specifically? I understand this to mean that engineering crops or microbes for the production of beneficial flavor compounds or the reduction of the production of off flavor would not be allowed. Is this correct?
Yeah, so this is correct. Breeding and engineering of crops or microbes is going to be out of scope for this. We 100% recognize that that's a very important part of research when it comes to flavor enhancement of these products. Just for this specific RFA, we do have to limit the scope, and that's part of limiting the scope as far as making it work for the timeline and budget that we have. And I would highly recommend folks read that full report that came out of the convening in July last year, because we really go into depth on kind of all the things that would be really helpful to get these ingredients to taste better and cost be more affordable. Yeah. Adam, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just a clarification that might help for some of the microbial and fermentation folks. There are going to be strains of microbes that are already genetically modified. Those are not out of scope because of that, but we don't want you trying to go in and develop new strains, which is time consuming and costly. And this is about taking strains that may need taste improvement and moving those forward in the ingredient development pipeline. So you can use material that has already been modified, so long as that's stored within the scope and approaches that we recognize as being acceptable to regulators and consumers. But you can't start again with that breeding or genetic engineering.
We have a few questions on this. Can organizations submit more than one proposal?
Yes, there is not a limit on the number of proposals per institution.
We have a follow-up question about the center of plate. The focus is on early stage development and ingredients that address flavor, but is it not expected that this be a food grade process? Are there requirements to demonstrate that there is a food safety review / process part of the proposal?
I think Adam did a good job of kind of answering a similar question earlier. Yes, Adam said something very similar earlier, and I would definitely say that if your process is food grade and already aligned with regulatory, obviously that's really great for a pathway towards industry. But with this, we are, funding fundamental research. So if it isn't going all the way towards regulatory pathways and having those discussions with food safety, that is okay. But I would highly recommend that food grade regulatory considerations are included while you're thinking about this. Because again, we want it to be feasible, we want it to actually work in industry. And in that case, it needs to be food grade and safe for that component.
Thank you. Is the eligibility limited to educational institutions, or any nonprofit research organization is eligible to apply?
It's limited to institutions of higher education. So degree granting institutions, which are typically colleges and universities, but I recognize there's some gray area beyond that. So institutions of higher education. That said, we encourage collaborations. And so if your institution is not eligible, we encourage you to try to find an eligible institution to collaborate with that can serve as the project grantee.
Thank you. We've got the question, the one that I read previously. In terms of hybrid ingredients, does protein blend with other macromolecules fall under the scope? Or is the focus completely on sole protein blends?
Yeah, I can take this one. So we're looking at center of plate options. So we're looking at meat, seafood, and then some of the dairy and egg replacements that were indicated. We acknowledge that there are going to be other macromolecules besides the protein. We're not looking for a protein isolate. There may be center of plate products that contain, for example, protein with fibers, carbohydrates, or fats. So all of that would still be considered in scope.
How critical is it for a project to produce a final plant-based product prototype to be competitive for funding, if the primary research objective is the optimization of plant protein ingredients intended for use in such applications?
Yeah, so that's not something we're requiring, but it could definitely make a proposal stronger to demonstrate a final product form or like target that the work is trying to drive towards, but it's not explicitly required to do that as part of the work.
Okay, we have a few more questions about GCO and GCMS. GCMS for volatile analysis. What about cell-based screening assays using heterologous expression of taste receptors to evaluate non-volatile taste compounds? And then for GCO, where a human is involved.
We have not had a discussion about GCO where a human is involved, but I think the answer, and maybe I'll get some nods here, is if you have a trained person that is involved in conducting an analytical part of the project, that should be fine, I believe. But maybe Nicholas, maybe you have another view of that. I think it would be fine. And then, yeah, I think any type of experiments that you would want to use in the lab, again, that doesn't require non-trained personnel, should be fine for demonstrating whatever analytics you would like to as far as taste goes or flavor.
Regarding multiple applications from a single institution, can a researcher be on more than one grant, whether it be as the PI or as a co-PI? I can read it one more time. Can a researcher be on more than one grant, whether it be as a PI or as a co-PI?
I can answer that one. FAR's default position is that an individual can serve as a PI on one application, but can serve as a co-PI on many. So you can be a co-PI on a couple different applications and then have one that where you're serving as a PI if you have people within your team.
Okay, it looks like we just have a few minutes left. I will pause here and hand it back to our hosts.
Okay. Thank you all so much for coming. As we've noted, the recording will be made available on the FAR website. Again, we encourage you to read the RFA closely, consider the research in scope, the research out of scope, and the evaluation criteria when you're drafting your proposals. You can also reach out to the contacts on the RFA page with any additional questions that you may have after the fact. And we encourage you to utilize the collaboration resources mentioned earlier, like the directory, like the ecosystem map, and like the collaboration information that you all have opted in to share, or that those of you who have opted in to share have opted in to share. So again, thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to see the proposals and to see the work that we're able to support through this partnership.